house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. Abraham Lincoln, 1858.
2 years before Abraham Lincoln became president, he could see great trouble brewing between the northern and southern states. They had been arguing for a whole generation, in Congress, in newspapers, in books, and face to face. By the time Lincoln became president in 1861, the House was falling, the Union was crumbling. Slavery, illegal in the North and depended upon in the South, was a major factor in their arguments. But there was more. The two regions were very different. They had different cultures and economies, different ideas of how a society should be run and what the Constitution meant, different goals for the country. Both feared the other was getting more than their fair share from the federal government. They were losing their ability to compromise. March 1861, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Soon after, 10 other states in the Deep South joined South Carolina to form the Confederate States of America. Within the year, the North and South were at war. The Civil War would split the nation in two. It would rage on for 4 years, cost 600,000 lives, and wound many more in body and spirit. It was a bloody war that at times pitted brother against brother. American men, some as young as 15 and 16 years old, slaughtered each other in small-town streets, wheat fields, and apple orchards. Whole cities were destroyed. How could this happen in America? The North and South had always had their disagreements, but they had been able to put them aside to form a union, the United States of America. So what changed? Why did Southern states decide to split from the North? What brought on the unimaginable horrors that nearly split America forever? In the early 1800s, America was growing in leaps and bounds. In the North, internal improvements and trade were the order of the day. Investors poured millions of dollars into transportation systems that would connect one region to the next for the benefits of trade. Completion of the Erie Canal made its investors wealthy men as food and produce poured into New York from the west and manufactured goods floated to the interior. A building boom in canals quickly followed. When Peter Cooper's Tom Thumb puffed out of Baltimore in 1830, few thought much of it. But by 1860, 9,000 miles of railroads linked the nation together. Europe, too, grew closer as the shift from sail to steam engine cut the travel time to Liverpool from New York from 49 to only 14 days. Most people still worked on farms, but the North was rapidly industrializing. Using new machines and interchangeable parts, Northern factories poured out sewing machines, farm machinery, clothing, and other goods. Americans were so good at it that the British called the making of things by machine, rather than hand, the American system of manufacturing. Industry created jobs. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany and teenagers from American farms poured into northern cities like Lowell, Massachusetts and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to work as wage earners in factories. Stores sprung up, shelves brimming with goods to sell to workers. Banks sprung up to finance business and trade. A booming market economy was transforming the North. Life was quite different in the South. There, agriculture was the major source of jobs and wealth. Long growing seasons and rich soil produced rice, tobacco, and cotton, cash crops grown for sale in distant markets. The vast majority of Southern whites were poor farmers who eked out a living as best they could. But big plantation owners with many slaves dominated the South. economically, socially, and politically. The North had outlawed slavery in the decades following the American Revolution. Back then, many Americans believed that slavery would die out on its own because it was no longer profitable. But then something happened. Raw cotton had always been very expensive because it took too long to separate the sticky seeds from the fiber. Then, in 1793, Eli Whitney, a young teacher from New England, invented the cotton gin. With this simple machine, a slave could clean more than 50 pounds of cotton a day. The cotton gin transformed cotton from a luxury item into the world's cheapest fabric. Booming textile factories in the northern states and England paid good money for all they could get, and the South was the world's major supplier.
There was a bigger demand for cotton, and in order to get that cotton, the South needed a lot of land. To work the land, they needed a large labor force, and the largest, cheapest labor force available was the enslaved African.
Doubling in value every 10 years, cotton production soon dominated the Southern economy. The Cotton Belt spread west across the South. Close to 1 million slaves were marched in chains to the southern frontier, where they cleared land and grew cotton to make their masters rich.
So by the end of the second decade of the 19th century, the states in the South, the Deep South, were really committed to slavery because it gave them an economic advantage.
The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. And where the blood ran the fastest, there he whipped the longest.
Southern wealth rested on the backs of slaves. Even though some slave owners treated their slaves well, Southern slavery was brutal, degrading, and deadly. Dressed only in coarse linen clothing, children received only 2 shirts a year. When these failed them, they went naked, winter or summer. It was not uncommon for slaves to work from dawn to dusk, then do their own washing, mending, and cooking before falling to sleep. They slept on cold, damp, bare floors, often with only a coarse blanket, even in the cold of winter. Slaves considered a good master one who gave them enough to fill their stomachs. Many had barely enough to eat. Believing that slaves couldn't be governed except with the whip, masters and overseers beat men and women, young and old, even pregnant women, for any reason or for none. Born a slave in Maryland, Frederick Douglass revealed the hardships and horrors of slavery in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. According to Douglass, to be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished.
Frederick Douglass in his autobiography talks about seeing a young mother beaten while her children watched, unable to do anything to stop them. And this is something that's hard for us to understand, but we just need to remember that the enslaved people were not considered people, they were considered property.
Slavery, Douglass observed, was dehumanizing, not only to the slave, but to the slaveholder as well. He would watch it turn his own mistress's tender heart to a stone. Before she learned how to be a proper slave master, his mistress did, however, give Douglass a gift that transformed his life. She taught him to read.
When she started to teach her son to read, she also taught Frederick, and she called her husband in to show him how quickly he had learned to read. And as soon as her husband saw Frederick with a book, he snatched it away and told her, "You must never teach a slave to read or to write."
A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master. If you teach that nigger how to read, there would be no keeping him.
These words burned in Douglass. He read and learned whenever he could. As it turned out, there was no keeping him. Douglass escaped in 1838 and soon thereafter became one of America's most powerful voices against slavery. Not every black man and woman in the South was a slave.
In the 1800s, during the period that slavery was still very much alive in this country, there were tens of thousands, actually, of African people, people of African descent, who were freed. one way or another. They had run away, they had managed to get free after their slave owners died, their relatives bought them out, and sometimes out of conscience, people would release their slaves.
Some of them traveled north, particularly places like Philadelphia, and increased the black population. And it was through free black community building that the modern black community emerged, so with churches, with organizations, with a sense of self. And even as they tried to become Americans, they also wanted to hold on to this separate identity. So it was a free black population that was increasingly conscious of its place in America and its need to define its place in America.
They held a variety of occupations. They were draymen, they were bricklayers, they were carpenters, and in fact, in Charleston, most of the building trades were dominated by free blacks.
But such cases were rare indeed. The vast majority of African Americans lived and died as slaves. Despite the harsh treatment, African American slaves and free blacks built a world of their own. Mixing African and American traditions, they poured out their joys and sorrows in music and dance, practiced their own brand of soulful Christianity, held on to their families as best they could, and carried on their private lives in the secrecy of the slave quarters. They resisted slavery in many ways, breaking tools, burning down barns and houses, running away to the north or to Indian tribes on the frontier. Some poisoned their masters. Some revolted. In 1811, slaves marched on New Orleans and were defeated in a pitched battle. Their decapitated heads were hung on poles as a warning to others. The greatest of all the uprisings took place in Southampton County, Virginia, and was led by a slave preacher named Nat Turner.
As I was praying one day at my plow, the Spirit spoke to me, saying, "Seek ye the kingdom of heaven, and all things shall be added unto you." I was greatly astonished, and for 2 years prayed continually. I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun darkened.
And he led a group of about 6 men heading from his owner's farm to an area called Jerusalem. On the way there, they killed 61 whites. The federal and state troops were called out against them, but they were able to elude them for about 6 weeks. Then they were captured, and he and 16 others were executed.
News of Turner's revolt spread terror throughout the South. Imagine what would happen if other slaves, now 1/3 of the Southern population, followed Turner's lead.
People lie down to sleep with fear. They hardly venture out on nights. A lady told me that for weeks after the tragedy, she had quivered at every blast of wind and every blow of the shutter.
White Southerners came to fear their slaves ever more, and so they clamped down. You see a whole series of post-Nat Turner laws that to make sure that the slave patrols actually went out on patrol to make sure that the slaves weren't assembling somewhere and gathering weapons and are going to rise up against their masters. Laws passed to prevent slaves from learning how to read and write so they couldn't communicate with one another and couldn't get these ideas. Because one of the other things white Southerners thought about was that, well, they couldn't have gotten ideas of freedom on their own account. They must have come from someplace else. Where? Why, they must have come from those abolitionists up in the North.
The Americans say that we are ungrateful, but I ask them, for heaven's sake, what should we be grateful to them for? For murdering our fathers and mothers? Or do they wish us to return thanks to them for chaining and handcuffing us, branding us, cramming fire down our throats, or for keeping us in slavery and beating us nearly or quite to death to make us work in ignorance and miseries, to support them and their families?
The publication of former slave David Walker's Appeal in 1829 hit the South like a thunderbolt. Calling for violent rebellion by slaves, it was the most vigorous denunciation of slavery ever published in the U.S.
In fact, the slaveholders in the South called upon the governor of Massachusetts to arrest David Walker, and they issued a $10,000 reward ransom for his head.
No compromise with slavery. No union with slaveholders,
cried William Lloyd Garrison, who, after reading Walker's Appeal and seeing slavery in practice on a visit to Baltimore, started the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1831. Calling for an immediate end to the institution of slavery, his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, quickly became the most important abolitionist publication in the country. Garrison pulled no punches in his denunciation of slaveholders.
We would sooner trust the honor of the country in the hands of the inmates of our penitentiaries and prisons than in their hands. They are the meanest of thieves and the worst of robbers. We do not acknowledge them to be within the pale of Christianity or republicanism or humanity.
Such strong talk alarmed not just Southerners, but Northerners as well, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion. Most Americans thought of abolitionists as dangerous troublemakers. Angry crowds nearly lynched Garrison in Boston, burned down the new Abolitionist Hall in Philadelphia, and murdered Elijah P. Lovejoy in Alton, Illinois. Many others would also lose their lives in the fight against slavery. Despite violence and opposition, the abolitionist movement quickly grew in the North among ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Free blacks in the North also played a key role in the abolitionist movement. They organized themselves into local anti-slavery societies and worked hand in hand with whites for the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad, of course, was not underground, and it was not a railroad. It was a hidden method of slaves to escape from the South to freedom either in the North or all the way to Canada.
Escaped slaves also played major roles. Frederick Douglass, William Box Brown, and Sojourner Truth wrote autobiographies and gave lectures on the horrors of slavery.
Then, of course, you had Harriet Tubman, who became a conductor in the Underground Railroad, who returned to the South at least 15 times and freed some 300 African Americans from slavery.
American women also gave strength to the movement, organizing meetings, circulating petitions, hiding runaway slaves, and lecturing. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a prominent South Carolina slaveholder, were pioneers in the anti-slavery and women's movement. Collectively, the abolitionists painted a hideous picture of slaveholders as corrupt aristocrats and flagrant sinners, beating old men, misusing slave women, drinking and dueling. The South banned the anti-slavery pamphlets and books, claiming they would induce slaves to slit their masters' throats. In the eyes of Southerners, abolitionists were fanatics, completely misrepresenting the Southern lifestyle. Tempers easily reached the breaking point.
Now, what would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? I will not stop to depict what everyone can imagine, but this is certain. England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her. No! You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king. Senator James H. Hammond, South Carolina, 1855.
Southerners defended slavery. They had to. They were so heavily invested in it that they had to provide what they thought was a reasonable argument. They loved to point their finger at Northern factory owners who had children and young women, as well as men, working in factories 10 or 12 hours a day in terrible conditions. Textile mills and breathing a lot of lint in the air and the fingers disappearing into machinery and so on. So the Southerners certainly argued that the North had its kind of industrial slavery and was living off the back of ill-fed, ill-clad workers, and that they took better care of their slaves in the South than workers could find in the North.
Southerners didn't just defend slavery as an economic necessity. They also insisted that it created a world better than that in the North.
Slavery was built on a false idea. That idea was that all blacks were meant to be slaves. God ordained them to be slaves. They came up with what they called the mud seal theory, where in every civilization you must have people at the bottom who will do all the heavy labor so that those whom God has supposedly favored can be the civilized group.
With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here the two, not only different, but called by the same name, liberty. Abraham Lincoln, 1864.
Well, the issue of liberty in the country always had been a point of controversy. There were people in the North who felt that you could never have a fully free society dedicated to the principle of liberty as long as you had slavery, and that slavery would blemish American society, would blemish democracy. In the South, there were those who felt there was really no contradiction, that they, in fact, were doing a good thing by building up the country and also by bringing benefit, they thought, to black people, and that it was their liberty to do as they pleased. To be interfered with would be against their liberty. So you had these conflicting views of liberty.
In this fight over different meanings of rights and liberty, the Constitution was unclear. Southerners pointed out that the Constitution left the issue of slavery under the control of individual states, and that it protected the rights of private property, including human property. Slaves were valuable property indeed. In the 1850s, a prime field hand cost as much as $2,000.
The South, by this point, believed really that they could not exist without slavery, and they were willing to go to war in order to preserve their right to own slaves.
With tensions so high over the issue of slavery, the nation's survival depended upon abolishing it. New states were being admitted to the Union in pairs, one slave state and one free. But could that balance be maintained? Missouri's petition for entrance as a slave state in 1819 would not only have broken the balance, but also permitted slavery in a northern territory. What was Congress to do? Henry Clay of Kentucky came up with a solution. Admit Maine as a free state and allow slavery in Missouri, but prohibit slavery everywhere else north of Missouri's southern border. His Missouri Compromise held the nation together, but it didn't end arguments over slavery. Victory in the Mexican-American War added vast new lands to the United States. Once again, the balance between free and slave states was threatened. In 1845, Texas joined the Union as a slave state. Congress deadlocked again in 1850 when California came up for statehood. Henry Clay and Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas hammered out another compromise. It was a complicated deal in which California entered the Union as a free state and the South got a new fugitive slave law, which gave slave owners the right to recapture slaves who had run away to the free states. Northerners were outraged to see their black neighbors kidnapped, jailed, and hauled back south without even the right to a trial. Outraged by the law, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book which drove home to millions the horrors and inhumanity of slavery.
And it's a book that really paints slavery as inhuman. Uncle Tom, whose name has come to mean something that it wouldn't mean if people actually read the novel, was a man who was beaten to death rather than betray other slaves. And not the slave owner, importantly, but the slave overseer was portrayed as being completely inhuman.
But it's a moving, romantic, sentimental novel that was written and plotted to show Americans what slavery did to a family and to individuals, so that Americans would be motivated to become abolitionists and, of course, to fight against slavery. And when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said to her, "This is the little woman who started the Great War," because indeed it was a tract or a piece at that time that made Americans take sides on the issue of slavery.
Kansas and Nebraska were the next territories up for statehood. Would they be slave or free? Senator Douglas came up with the answer.
If the people of Kansas want a slave-holding state, let them have it. And if they want a free state, they have a right to it. And it's not for the people of Illinois or Missouri or New York or Kentucky to complain, whatever the decision of the people of Kansas may be.
In the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Congress decided to let the people make their own decision about slavery. Local self-determination seemed to make sense. But people poured in from north and south, and by 1856, bloody Kansas had become a killing ground as free soilers and pro-slavers beat and murdered each other in the fight for control. Along with briefcases and paperwork, congressmen and senators now brought knives and pistols with them to work. They could see the hatred in each other's faces. While politicians passed complicated laws to keep the Union together, real people were being hurt by them. The issue of slave versus free state came to a head in 1857 when the Supreme Court ruled against Missouri slave Dred Scott in his petition for freedom. Back in the 1830s, Scott's master had taken him to live in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory.
Dred Scott sued his master in Missouri, basically saying that when his master had taken him to free territory in Illinois and in what is now Minnesota, he had become free because according to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery could not exist in free territories.
His owners argued that property was property, which they could take wherever they wanted, free state or not.
Well, Dred Scott, of course, lost the case in 1857. When the Supreme Court decided to say that Dred Scott was not a citizen of the United States, that blacks had no rights that a white man was bound to respect, and they essentially said that the Congress could not regulate slavery in the United States.
It then ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it interfered with people's rights to control their own property. Did this mean that people could keep slaves anywhere in the Union? The court didn't say. With this fateful ruling, the arguments that had held the nation together went out the window. In the North, voters outraged at the threat of slavery spreading to their own states flocked to a new political party organized in 1854 to keep slavery out of the territories. Under the motto of free soil, free labor, free men, the Republican Party cemented its hold on the North, while the South cemented its control of the Democratic Party. Illinois, 1858. The Senate race between Democratic Party leader Stephen Douglas and an obscure one-time congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln rivets national attention as Lincoln and Douglas debate the fate of the Union.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided.
Lincoln is persuasive, but the voters go for Douglas, who beats Lincoln in a close election. October 16, 1859. John Brown and 20 heavily armed black and white followers seized the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, hoping to start a slave rebellion that would spread through the South.
And the purpose was simply to arm the slaves so that they could fight for their own freedom. And that particular action showed the South that abolitionists were willing to do more than just talk in order to bring about an end to slavery. And it really frightened them.
Convicted and condemned to hang for the attack, Brown remains defiant to the last.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away.
November 1860. Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln wins a four-way race for President of the United States, though he isn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. Although Lincoln is personally against slavery, his main goal is to preserve the Union. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln assures the South he will protect their rights.
I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists.
Fearing that the Republican victory will leave them outnumbered in Congress, the southern states decide to leave the Union. As each new state secedes, a bell tolls in Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederates' temporary capital city. By spring 1861, 11 states have joined the new Confederate States of America. In Charleston, South Carolina, Major Robert Anderson of the United States Army and his 78 men have been holed up in Fort Sumter for more than 4 months. Their presence in the very center of the secession is an intolerable insult to Southern pride. At 4:30 a.m., April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery men opened fire on Fort Sumter. Northern troops returned the fire. 34 hours later, an exhausted Major Anderson sadly surrenders the fort.
Our Southern brethren have done grievous wrong. They have rebelled and have attacked their father's house and loyal brothers. They must be punished and brought back, but this necessity breaks my heart.
Lincoln promptly calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection of the South. The Confederate Congress declares war. North and South have become two countries. The Union lies in shambles. It is time for war.